I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. The murder and mayhem we're talking about today is literally an episode of history that I thought every person had heard about. It was only recently that it occurred to me that I probably only learned about this event in history because I grew up in the town in which it took place. What I grew up learning about was Quantrill's raid, otherwise known as the Lawrence Massacre, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Free State High School, which was my high school, is a nod to the Kansans during this era that were opposed to slavery, the Free Staters. Another term used for these folks is the Jayhawkers, which today is a term used to describe any native Kansan. Well, this Jayhawker is ready to drink, so let's get started. I have no real reason for today's margarita, except that whenever I think of the Civil War, I just think of the cherry. I did a little Googling, as one does, and discovered that at least one eccentric Civil War general, Francis Barlow, enjoyed climbing cherry trees and munching on the delicious treat. So yeah, there's the connection, right? Since this is another frozen margarita, I've gone ahead and prepared it in advance, but I have to say, if we decide to make a top 10 list of margaritas at the end of the year, okay, you don't have to pull my leg. We'll make a top 10 list of margaritas at the end of the year. This one is going to be on the list. For this particular recipe, you're going to take 2 parts tequila, 1 part triple sec, 1 part cherry juice. Try to get pure cherry juice, 1 part lime juice, and a full 16-ounce bag of frozen cherries. I mean, if you wanted to do less cherries, you could, but why would you want to do that? Then you're going to blend it up and pour it into a salt-rimmed glass. If you're feeling extra bougie, you can put cherries on the rim. Before we start, I'm just going to put a little plug in for the movie Ride with the Devil, starring Tobey Maguire, Skeet Ulrich, and Jewel. This film, which was made in 1999, does a really good job of capturing the feeling of the era. It is a movie, not a documentary, but other than the obnoxious Hollywood necessary love story, the historical parts of the film are pretty accurate. Also, fun fact, I actually auditioned to be an extra in this movie when I was in middle school. I didn't get a part, and I didn't actually watch the movie, it was rated R after all, until I was getting ready for this episode. I do know several people who are extras and small parts in the film because they actually hired a lot of people from Lawrence to be in the movie. How cool. Quick note, I actually had no idea that some people called this the Lawrence Massacre until I was doing research for this episode. So we're going to go ahead and call it Quantrill's Raid because that's what I grew up learning that it was called. William Quantrill was born on July 31st, 1831. He was the oldest of a lot of kids. Some reports say 8, some reports say 12, but it was a lot of kids. His parents were named Thomas and Caroline Quantrill. I think it's safe to say that Billy Quantrill did not have the greatest role models growing up. One of his uncles was actually a pirate, and one of his grandfathers was a professional gambler. Even his father, who managed to become a school principal, was accused of both embezzlement and assault. His father was abusive, often beating young Bill. Many people told stories of Bill as a child, saying that he tortured animals for fun. He would often shoot pigs through the ears and delighted to hear them squeal. He would tie cats' tails together and throw them over a clothesline to watch them claw each other to death. He would often nail snakes to trees. Yeah, Bill might have displayed some early warning signs of what was to come later. Bill was a very intelligent young man and actually became a school teacher at the age of 16, following his dad into the education profession. He taught for just a little bit. In 1854, when Bill was 23 years old, but many of his siblings were children still, his father died of tuberculosis. This left the family in a tremendous amount of debt. Bill worked to help support his family through working as a school teacher, and his mom actually opened up their house to be a boarding home. This embarrassed Bill to no end. To him, it showed a lack of status. I'd like to take a moment to talk about Bleeding Kansas. While the official declaration of the Civil War happened in 1861 at Fort Sumter, North Carolina, the conflict had been brewing for years on the western side of the United States, specifically in Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is the term used to describe the 6 years of incredibly bloody conflict that preceded the Civil War. This all happened during the settling of the Kansas Territory. At the heart of the conflict was the decision of whether Kansas would become a slave state or a free state upon entry into the Union. Nebraska, the territory to the north, would automatically become a free state. But because Kansas shared a border with Missouri, a slave state, there was a question as to what type of state it would become. This was a question of national importance because at the time, the Senate was split pretty much evenly, and so Kansas would become the deciding vote, pro or anti-slavery, within the United States Senate. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas to help make the decision as to whether or not Kansas would be slave or free. Violence soon erupted as both factions fought for control. On May 21st, 1856, ruffians looted Lawrence, Kansas, an anti-slavery stronghold. In response, John Brown organized the murder of 5 pro-slavery settlers in Pottawatomie. This was known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Honestly, John Brown should probably get his own episode. Check out this mural from the Kansas State Capitol building where you can see John Brown holding a rifle in one outstretched hand and a Bible in the other. It's probably my favorite piece of art, period, honestly. And this man really knew how to cause some mayhem, all in his mission to overthrow slavery in the southern states. Anyway, it was into this basket of fireworks that Bill Quantrill was thrown with a lit match. From 1853 to 1858, Bill sort of wandered around the western United States, trying to find his way. He worked in various trades in Illinois, Colorado, Utah, Indiana, and more before finding his way to Kansas in 1858. He first earned a living as a poker player, going under the name Charlie Hart. But in 1859, he took a job as a school teacher at a school outside of Lawrence. The school closed in 1860, and so Bill was left trying to find money somehow. At this point, it seems he did a little cattle rustling to earn money before joining a group of border ruffians and fleeing to Missouri in 1860. Evidently, Bill played both sides. Evidently, Bill earned money by both helping jayhawkers to liberate slaves and pro-slavery folks by capturing and returning escaped slaves. He strikes me as an opportunist, playing both sides as long as it earned him money. For what it's worth, his mom would say later that she'd always raised him to be anti-slavery. And for a while, in his letters to his mom, it seemed like he was anti-slavery. But, in part because of people like John Brown, he sort of flipped his political views. Bill sided with the Confederacy at the outset of the Civil War in 1861. By late 1861, Bill had organized a group of hundreds of men who would attack Unionists on the Missouri-Kansas border. He told this story of how his older brother, remember friends, he was the oldest child, but his imaginary oldest brother had been killed by jayhawkers in Kansas. It's a far more dramatic story than we have time to get into today, but let's just say that Bill wanted revenge. Sweet, sweet revenge for the death of his imaginary brother. He decided to do this by joining the Confederate Army. However, despite the fact that the Confederate Army had their own rules and regulations, Bill sorta did whatever he wanted. He gathered his group of merry men, bushwhackers, a group of guys who all, it seems, had their own axe to grind. His crew included outlaw Jesse James and his brother Frank. Another member was a man named Bloody Bill Anderson, a one-time horse thief that a local newspaper called a heartless scoundrel. During this time, both sides were raiding each side of the Kansas-Missouri border, and Kansas continued to bleed. Arson, indiscriminate murder of innocent civilians for the cause of revenge, as well as looting and stealing, were done by both sides. By the way, at this time, the war was raging full force in the East. But the war was basically over in Missouri in 1862, and it never officially made its way into Kansas. It was during this time that 25-year-old Bill met 13-year-old Sarah King. She would eventually run off from her home and marry him, and they spent most of their very short marriage living in tents together on the battlefield. In August of 1863, Unionists began capturing and imprisoning female family members of the ruffians from Missouri. They focused particularly on the Sisters of Quantrill's raiders, and many of these girls, maybe all of them, were under the age of 20. One of the makeshift jails they constructed to house these border ruffians' sisters collapsed, killing 4 and severely injuring several others. Bloody Bill Anderson had 3 sisters in this jail. One was killed instantly, one was permanently disabled, and one suffered a severe facial injury. He would scream their names as he entered towns that he was raiding for the rest of his life. This incident enraged Quantrill's raiders and gave him exactly the fuel he needed to start the fire that he had been planning for years, an attack on Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence was an anti-slavery bastion, the heart of the resistance, a stop on the Underground Railroad, the soul of abolition in Kansas, the place that had closed the school that he worked in and failed to recognize his genius. Quantrill's raiders numbered 450 men. Honestly, they weren't even really men. Most of them were teenage boys. The youngest was 13. These children, who did not yet have fully formed brains but had been armed with guns, approached Lawrence from the east in several separate columns that then converged before dawn on August 21st, 1863. Many of the men had been traveling for more than 24 hours and strapped themselves to their horses to prevent themselves from falling off if they fell asleep. Almost all of them were armed with multiple 6-shot revolvers. At least one person saw the riders approaching and attempted to warn the people of Lawrence, Kansas, but didn't make it to the town in time. They first killed the Reverend Samuel S. Snyder as he milked his cow. He was a pastor of the United Brethren Church and a chaplain to Black Union troops. They quickly gained control of the Eldridge House, which was a huge brick hotel in the center of downtown. This became their headquarters during the raid. Raiders spared most of the lives of the hotel residents, but looted them of their belongings and eventually burned the hotel to the ground. The infant son of black cook Peter Jones would be killed in that fire. They broke into smaller groups, and over a 4-hour period, they looted, pillaged, and set fire to most of Lawrence, Kansas. They also drank a lot. They took everything they could hold from most of the banks and stores and murdered every man on site, armed or unarmed. In fact, most of the men killed by Bill and his raiders didn't have any weapon of any kind. The youngest victim was likely 10 or 12 years old. His name was Bobby Martin. The brutality seemed to know no bounds, particularly if you were in the group being led by Bloody Bill Anderson. They killed a man lying sick in his bed. They shot an entire group of men and boys that had surrendered, and they tied 2 men together and forced them to walk into a burning building. Several witnesses maintained that the women were the true heroes of the day. Because the men were under strict orders to hurt no women, the women followed the raiders around, putting the fires out as soon as they lit them. They heckled them to get the heck out of their town. Elizabeth Fisher hid her husband by rolling him up in a carpet and rolling him out of their burning home. They both survived. By 9 a.m., the raiders were headed out of town, evading the few units that followed in pursuit. When the dust settled in Lawrence, over a quarter of the buildings had been burned to the ground. 182 men were killed. That was about 32% of the male population of Lawrence, and around 10% of the population as a whole. It was the single largest atrocity committed on civilians during the American Civil War. In fact, it's the 7th largest massacre in the United States' history by raw numbers alone, let alone percentages. We call it a massacre because a massacre generally means that the act was morally unacceptable and usually involves the attack of defenseless victims. I'd say people whose only crime was being outside milking their cow is pretty defenseless. The rules of war never tolerated killing civilians, and Quantrill's raid was truly an embarrassment to the Confederate military command. Bill was later denied command of Confederate troops based on this attack. This level of violence was unfathomable to the 19th century mind. William Gregg and Cole Younger, 2 of Bill's right-hand lieutenants, actually quit and left in disgust because of Quantrill's raid and later acts of violence. Bill and his men quarreled. His once large band broke up into several smaller insurgent groups. In the spring of 1865, now leading a band of a few dozen uninformed war losers, Bill led a series of raids in Kentucky. Remember, the war was over by 1865. On May 10th, Bill and his band were caught in a Union ambush, and Bill was shot and paralyzed from the chest down. He was brought to Louisville, Kentucky, and taken to the military hospital there, where he died of his wounds in June of 1865. William Quantrill was 27 years old. Parts of him are buried, or allegedly buried, in 3 different locations. Louisville, Kentucky, where he died, Dover, Ohio, where he's born, and Higginsville, Missouri, where some people hailed him as a hero. There are gravestones at each site, but that's the story for another episode. His wife, Sarah, would marry 4 more times, and at one point was the owner of a well-known house of prostitution in St. Louis, Missouri. She died in 1930. Most of Bill's bushwhacker buddies died in violent skirmishes during the last vestiges of the Civil War. The city of Lawrence would rebuild, including the Eldridge Hotel, which still stands today, and the progressive, egalitarian spirit remains. It might even be a little bit stronger thanks to William Quantrill. Alrighty, so let's talk about Bill's motives and mental state. We've got quite the list to go through. Abuse of animals as a child. Consistently lying to anyone he needed to in order to further his cause. This included lying to his mother every time he wrote to her, saying that he was going to send her money and never did. This includes the wild tale that he spun of an older brother that was murdered by the Unionists, even though he was the oldest child. The incredibly violent massacre that he orchestrated and executed with no remorse, even after 2 of his right-hand men quit in disgust. Impulsive decision-making, often based in either real or imagined slights from others. And a general disregard of safety, either for himself or those that he commanded, throughout all of his military career. And I'm sure there's probably some more. Does any of this sound familiar to a mental illness that you may have heard of? I think one might declare he sounds like a psychopath. And in this case, I think you'd be hitting the nail on the head. Fun fact, psychopath is not actually the official psychiatric term. When we use the term psychopath, and I mean when we're really using it instead of just trying to be rude, but when we really use the term psychopath, what we mean is a condition known as antisocial personality disorder. This mental condition occurs when people show a pattern of manipulation or violation of the rights of other people. And in this case, antisocial probably doesn't mean what you think it does either. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to be around other people. It means that they violate and go against the social rules and norms of a society. According to one study about psychopathy that I'll be sure to link in the description box below, quote, psychopaths can be alarmingly violent, both in the frequency with which they engage in violence and the gratuitous extent of their violent acts, end quote. I don't know if any historical psychiatrists Honestly, I don't know if that's even a thing. But if it is a thing, I don't know if any historical psychiatrists have diagnosed William Quantrill as having antisocial personality disorder, but I certainly will. Strikes me as a textbook case. So what do you think? Have you even heard of Quantrill's raid before today? Are you from a state other than Kansas and have heard of Quantrill's raid? What are some historical events that you've heard of that you're surprised that nobody else has? Have you ever gone back and done research on something that you grew up learning about and realizing you might not have heard the full story? Man, what about Billy Quantrill? What do you think about his opportunistic agenda? What, if anything, would be the tipping point for you to abandon your morals for self-gain? Were the raiders justified in doing what they did at Lawrence, Kansas? Did the punishment fit the crime, so to speak? I found myself fascinated the entire time I was doing research for this episode. It's been a while since I learned about Quantrill's raid, but I can tell you right now, I don't remember ever being taught the causes for Quantrill's raid. I'm pretty sure that I was either taught or my child brain remembers that Quantrill's raid came to attack Lawrence because Lawrence was against slavery and Quantrill was for slavery. But my goodness, it is more complicated than that. William Quantrill may have been opportunistic, but his men came that day with a whole variety of their own personal motives. Most of them were seeking revenge simply for what had happened to their families, much more so than the moral cause of slavery versus no slavery. It's like someone started shooting and then no one knew how to stop. Revenge after revenge after revenge until, after a while, nobody really realizes what they're even fighting for. I always just thought that Quantrill's raiders were the big bad guys who loved slavery, and the poor Free Staters just got massacred for no reason. As usual, it's just much more nuanced than that. But don't misunderstand me. Quantrill's raid, the Lawrence Massacre, was wrong. What William Quantrill did was wrong. And Quantrill's raiders were on the wrong side of history, no matter how you slice it. Thanks for hanging out with me and enjoying this delicious frozen cherry margarita. If you have an idea for a margarita or a case, feel free to join us on social media. We have a Facebook and an Instagram. Links are in the description box. Next week is April Fool's Day, and what better way to celebrate this random holiday than with a woman who faked her own death and got away with it? Intrigued? I hope so. See you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murder and burning an entire city down.